tenure and rights, provide better management related to land use planning and protected areas. The African Union Land Governance Strategy also recognizes the importance of good land governance in addressing some of the climate-related challenges faced on the African continent. Our event today is being held under the theme, Effective Land Use and Governance, Pivotal Elements in Africa's Efforts Towards Mitigation and Adaptation to Climate Change. The event is intended to create an understanding of the key policy measures pertaining to land that can contribute to mitigating climate change and its devastating impacts. My name is Janet Edeme. I head the Rural Development Division at the African Union Commission, and I'm also the acting head for Agriculture and Food Security Division. And I'll be your moderator for this side event. We have a couple of expectations from the conversation we're having this afternoon. We actually have about 4 key expectations. First of all, we are looking at using this platform and the discussions we'll be having to enhance our understanding of the challenges, opportunities, and key issues related to land use and governance for climate resilience in Africa. Secondly, through these discussions we'll be having this afternoon in terms of providing policy recommendations for integrating climate considerations into land use planning processes, strengthening land tenure and governance systems, and promoting sustainable land management practices. Thirdly, we would like to use this event to increase and support approaches, climate-smart agriculture, and community participation in land use and governance decision-making processes. And finally, to strengthen partnerships and collaborations among stakeholders, including governments, the civil society organizations, research institutions, and private sector actors, to support innovative solutions and knowledge sharing on issues pertaining to land governance and climate change. Now, before we proceed further, and according to our agenda, I would like to invite Dr. Godfrey Bahigwa, the AU Director for Agriculture, Rural Development, to provide the opening remarks on behalf of Her Excellency Ambassador Joseph Asako, the AU Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy, and Sustainable Environment. Dr. Godfrey Bahigwa, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Janet. As introduced, I'm Godfrey Bahigwa, Director of Agriculture and Rural Development. I'm here to read the statement of Her Excellency Ambassador Joseph Asako, the Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment of the AU Commission. So these are her words. I'm going to read her statement verbatim. Excellencies, representatives of various governments, international partner organizations, dear participants, all protocols observed. On behalf of the chairperson of the African Commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, I'm honored to deliver the opening remarks during this important side event on land governance and climate change that is of the Africa Climate Summit. As our planet faces unprecedented challenges due to climate change, it is essential that we focus our efforts on effective land use and governance towards mitigation and adaptation. The theme for this side event, as you have heard from Dr. Edeme, is effective land use and governance, pivotal elements in Africa's efforts towards mitigation and adaptation to climate change. We have gathered here today because we recognize the integral role that land plays in climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. Land is not only a vital resource for agriculture, food security, and livelihoods, but it also serves as a crucial component in combating the effects of climate change. All economic activities take place on land. Ladies and gentlemen, the detrimental impact of climate change is already being felt across the continent. Unpredictable weather patterns, rising temperatures, and reduced rainfall have severely affected the livelihoods of millions of people who depend on agriculture and natural resources. These changes are being amplified by the fast-growing population and an increasing denser distribution and increased competition for natural resources, especially land. Therefore, an effective approach to land governance is essential in order to strike a balance between development, conservation, and climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. We must ensure that land resources are sustainably managed and that policies are put in place to promote resilient land use practices. We therefore cannot go away from this important summit without discussing the issue of land governance as it pertains to climate change. The key focus of this side event is to explore and ensure a common understanding of key policy measures pertaining to land that can contribute to mitigating climate change and its devastating impacts. The side event is providing a unique platform for knowledge sharing and learning about best practices, challenges, and opportunities related to land use and governance in Africa. We will hear from experts who have implemented successful and innovative initiatives and experiences from across our continent, showcasing their tangible outcomes in mitigating climate change. We will also have the chance to identify policy gaps, institutional challenges, and capacity needs in land use and governance for climate resilience. The African Union Commission recognizes the role of land governance in addressing the climate-related disasters that the continent has been experiencing. The AU Land Governance Strategy, the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction are a few of the African Union frameworks that emphasize the critical role that land governance plays in mitigating climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, this side event should remind us that as Africans, our lives are deeply connected to our land, and more importantly, the way we use and manage this vital asset has significant impacts on climate change. As policymakers, land administrators, and citizens, we therefore need to be cautious of the decisions we make concerning land. As contained in the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan, I urge all of us to ensure that land policies are being developed and land reform processes all incorporate critical measures that can be put in place to prevent and mitigate climate change in Africa. Land matters should not be disconnected from our discussions on climate change. I also want to emphasize that in all our discussions and approaches on promoting good land governance to address climate change, let us ensure that women, youth, and other vulnerable groups who are critical land users are involved in discussions and decision-making, as well as part of the implementation of the different initiatives that are being developed and implemented. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I invite each and every one of you to actively participate, share your expertise and experiences, and contribute to the solutions for effective land use and governance. Together, we can create a resilient future where land is sustainably managed and climate change impacts are mitigated. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Director, for the statement on behalf of Her Excellency, and also for setting the scene and reminding us that our lives are deeply connected to land as Africans, And when we're discussing the issues around land, let's not disconnect it. The issues around and discussions around climate change should not be disconnected from our land, and also ensuring that our women and youth are also in the center of these discussions on climate change. So thank you very much, Director, for those statements. Now, we have mentioned a bit about the African Union Land Governance Strategy, and I'm sure that most of us have not heard of the strategy. So this would be a very good opportunity for us to give you a snapshot, a synopsis of what the strategy contains. So to do that, I'll be inviting my colleague, Ms. Nsama Chikolwa, to take us very briefly through the African Union Land Governance Strategy. Nsama.
Pleasant afternoon to all of you. Thank you for according me this opportunity. And to start with, I want to share that in 2009, the African Union heads of state and government endorsed the African Union Declaration on Land Issues and Challenges in Africa. And what's very critical is that in this declaration, there's an emphasis that land is important and critical to attaining sustainable socio-economic growth and development in Africa. And based on this, to ensure efficient implementation of the AU Declaration on Land, the African Union Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment, DABE, has developed a land governance strategy. The land governance strategy was adopted by the 4th ordinary session of the Specialized Technical Committee on Agriculture, Rural Development, Water and Environment in 2021. Now, if we look at the land governance strategy, the process started by engaging different stakeholders to understand some of the challenges that are being faced on the African continent with regards to land tenure and rights. And what came out critically as one of the challenges was that there's this connection between land governance and climate change that continues to exist on the continent. One of the greatest challenges that we see is that the different weather conditions that are being experienced on the continent do have an impact on communities in several parts of the continent. For instance, floods have actually led to the dislocation and displacement of some communities where they're not even able to go back to their lands. This will be spoken more in depth by one of the presenters. Other than that, there are also many conflicts that have been experienced on the continent. This has been mostly due to changes in, for instance, the availability of natural resources, and for instance, herders looking for more fertile lands or places where there are natural resources that are available. So in some instances, you find that there are conflicts between herders and farmers and other land users. Now, once we look at the overall land governance strategy, the land governance strategy, therefore, is been developed to address most of these issues that not only have to do with climate change, but different elements. But what is critical is that most of these issues are actually interrelated. Therefore, the overall vision of the AU land governance strategy is to coordinate, is a continent where land is responsibly governed, equitably distributed and sustainably used for the benefit of citizens of member states to ensure inclusive development while reducing the adverse impacts of land use on humans and the environment. And if you look at the goal is actually well aligned with the vision. During the process of developing the land governance strategy, we also developed set a number of principles. So you find that these principles were proposed by representatives of member states, civil society, and different entities. And they made proposals on what are the key guiding principles that should actually guide us as we govern land, as we administer land on the African continent. So presented before you are some of the key principles that people thought should be reflected within the strategy. The strategy has 5 strategic objectives. All in all, these will be implemented coherently. And the first one talks about strengthening the capacity of the UAU Commission, the African Land Policy Center, which is the a body that is mandated to champion the implementation of the AU Agenda on Land. AUDA, NEPAD, and the Regional Economic Communities and other member states to implement the AU Agenda on Land. So we hope that the capacities of everyone involved in actual land governance is enhanced throughout the continent. In addition, we're also promoting the advancement of land policies and laws and administration systems so that in AU member states we can see an improvement in terms of land administration. Other than that, we hope through the land governance strategy that we'll be able to promote responsible land-based investments in Africa that are environmentally sound, scalable, and inclusive. When we talk about inclusion, we take note the need to involve different stakeholders on the ground when we talk about land investments on the continent. There's also a focus through the objectives to enhance security of land tenure and access to land and other productive resources for everyone, but particularly women, youth, pastoralists, indigenous people, and other vulnerable groups on the continent. Other than that, when all this work is being conducted, we hope to have a strong monitoring system so that we could be able to monitor progress towards achievement of the different objectives. Now, pertaining to climate change, the land governance strategy has certain broad measures that we will focus on. I must mention that there are other activities that will be implemented coherently under these measures. So, firstly, we want implementing land planning policies for shock management in different parts of the continent. And we want to also collaborate with different stakeholders in the design and implementation of national regulations for integrated and sustainable management of water, forest, fragile coastal lands to minimize the risks of environmental disasters or any impacts that are caused by climate change. Other than that, we'd like to promote the inclusion of land rights protection and access to land for all categories of landowners in climate change and environmental degradation mitigation regulations and strategies. So this event, just as a follow-up to what Dr. Janet had mentioned, this should be a platform for us to have a deep discussion on this nexus that we have been talking about. Really, how do the two interact? How better can we govern our land so that climate change is mitigated on the continent? The land governance strategy will be launched during the Conference on Land Policy in Africa, which will take place from the 20th to the 24th of November 2023. And we invite you all to participate in this event and the launch. And if you have not registered for the Conference on Land Policy, we have provided a link through which you can register. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nsama, for setting how we're going to take forward our conversation this afternoon. Now, to take us further in this discussion this afternoon and also to give us their various perspectives, we have 5 panelists who will be joining the director up here on the podium. May I begin by inviting Professor Sylvana Rudith King from, please could you give her a round of applause? She's from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and also a member of the Network for Land Governance in Africa. Next, I would like to invite Japhet Selu, who is the Chief Officer for Carbon and Conservation at the Community Markets for Conservation, Komako in Zambia, and is also a representative from a GIZ initiative on climate resilience and management of natural resources in the SADC region. Then I would invite Mr. Japhet Kasimbu, who is a transhumans expert at the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, also known as IGAD. And then Mr. Odas Kubwimana, who is the Africa Regional Coordinator at the International Land Coalition. We also have another panelist who has sent us a recording of her presentation, and we will play it later. So I will begin with Professor King. So Professor, you have listened to the presentation on the land governance strategy and how we are trying to contextualize it for the benefit of this particular event on the issues related to its impact on climate change. So just very briefly, maybe 3 to 5 minutes, what aspects do you think we are still overlooking when we speak of climate change, flood management, hazards, and land tenure? Prof, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. We have been engaged as NELGA partners at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. We've been engaged in empirical research to determine the gaps. And we've just completed research work on flood and land. And what we discovered is that even though we always talk about inequalities related to land and access to land and so on, the gap seems to be wider. The inequalities are wider. We know that in Ghana, about 60% of the settlements are urbanized, and more people are moving to the urban center. And many of these people turn out to be migrant women. So there's inequality in assessing land between migrants and indigents. And as a result, the migrants tend to occupy the less prime land in urban setting. And occupying less prime land means that accessibility is only affordable to those who can occupy the prime lands. And these poor migrants, many of whom are women, tend to occupy the less prime lands, which are prone to flooding. So not only do we have inequality related to the gap between those who have access and those who do not have access to land, but we also have inequality between migrants and indigents, the rich and the poor, women and men. So in effect, having access to land is confronted with so many gaps that we are yet to identify. And as a result, many of these women and children are displaced, but we do not have the strategy to cope with displacement when it comes to women. And I think this is a gap that we need to identify and work around and to see if we can solve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. You have talked about the challenges that we're facing in terms of some of the migrants and others who are falling through the cracks. So now, with that, I'm going to look at Odas. Odas, you've listened to Professor. She's talking about the challenges we're facing with some of our citizens who are on the edges when we're talking about issues surrounding land governance. So how can we achieve a people-centered land governance in addressing the climate-related challenges that we're facing in Africa today?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I think the continent is actually not short of good policies. I think if you were to tackle issues of land governance, and therefore increase resilience and capacity for especially smallholder farmers to cope with climate change, we need to invest in policy implementation. We've seen across the continent many countries with very good progressive land policies and laws. But when it comes to the implementation, that's where I think we really miss it. And my call today would be to African Union member states and development partners to support the implementation of the very progressive land policies and laws that we have on the continent. I think the African Union has really made a very good, I think, to launch what we called the African Union framework and guidelines on land policy. We just concluded a study last year that was actually kind of looking at how these FNGs have really helped the continent. And talking to several member states and other actors, they really recognize that this framework has really triggered a lot of reforms across the continent. And the last decade has really seen a lot of so nice land policies and laws in different countries. I think we probably need another framework that would trigger implementation. And that's why I think we would really, as land actors, contribute to adapting and mitigating climate change. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Odas. You've talked about the issues around ensuring that we actually need to implement our policies. We already have good land policies, but we're having challenges with regards to implementation. And you have also called on governments because they are the key policymakers. So building on your intervention, let me turn to Japheth Kasimbu. Japheth, Odas has talked about governments ensuring that they implement these policies. So what critical steps related to land governance needs to be taken by governments to address the climate-related challenges and risks, particularly from a very specific group of people, the pastoralists, just to try to give us some context?
Thank you so much. And Janet, I'll begin by just making 3 statements. First, the climate change impact, it represents a critical nexus of environmental, economic, and also the political factors. And that intricate interplay means we need a lot of collaboration between those. Where we're talking about environmental factors, that's where land issues fall on. If you're talking about climate change and the carbon emission, and also we're talking about carbon sinks, where does it lie? We don't have that land. How do we solve that? We're having a lot of policies about climate change, but are we leaving behind the land issues? The sub-Saharan, second thing I'll mention is that the sub-Saharan Africa, despite contributing minimally to global carbon emission, it showed us the disproportionate burden of the climate effects. And therefore, that is to say that if I look at where I am working from at the IGAD level, the IGAD is just a microcosm of the general African, conundrum of the climate issues. And when we look at the issues affecting the whole of the sub-Saharan region, then we need to understand that the challenges are more, in this continent than they are experienced in the other parts of the world. The climate financing discussions in Africa, therefore, finally, as I mentioned, is that they relay, or rather they epitomize the intricate dance between this land ownership and environmental factors and the factors on politics, the political and international interests. Each one have their own interests. Who has the interest on land ownership of the vulnerable and marginalized people? Within our region, which is the IGA region, over 70% of our land is arid and semi-arid. Mainly these arid and semi-arid regions are occupied by the mobile communities and dominantly the pastoralistic communities. What it means is that the pastoral communities own or live in more than 70% of our land in the region. And they are the biggest groupings, as we can talk about in Africa. That means, and it's a community that experiences a lot of conflict, which conflicts, border around the land issues, land ownership, resource conflict. And when talking about the resources, land is a key resource. What are we doing about it? I think we've taken up measures in the IGAD as a land governance strategy, which mirrors the AU strategy on land governance, but more down working with the communities and the pastoral groups. We are sensitizing our member states to ensure that we need to move ahead and harmonize our land use and land utilization policies and laws. Because in some countries, land can only be leased, and land is owned by only the government, can only be leased to the public, to the members of the public. In other countries, land can be owned communally by these communities. What are we doing about that? So we need, when we're talking about carbon sinks, who benefits from carbon credits? You need to have land rights, land ownership rights. We're going to help them to own the land before we can talk about them benefiting from the carbon credits. Because that's what it means, that the money would be going to other beneficiaries and not the actual communities which are supposed to benefit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Japhet. And I'm going to, from your last comments, I will turn to your name, Japhet, as well. Now, Japhet, since we began this climate summit, there have been a lot of high-level discussions about, climate financing, decarbonizing economies, etc. And I know that you've done some work at a very small micro level in some villages and around the Kasungu-Lukususi area of the Malawi-Zambia transfrontier. Now, what lessons from that study can you share on how communities can use carbon markets to financially self-sustain conservation efforts?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I would like to share my experience from Zambia in the eastern part of the country. This is where we work with rural communities, most small-scale farmers, to implement climate-smart practices like agriculture, taking care of their remaining forests in their chiefdoms. Basically, we started this work way back somewhere in 2011, engaging these communities by training them, sensitizing them on the importance of them adopting the key practices that would help them to mitigate some of the key climate change challenges that they go through. We've seen this from these communities. Whenever these communities adopt the practices in terms of agriculture, in terms of taking care of their forests in their communities, they can actually sequester carbon in the soils. They can actually trap carbon in the trees for a longer period of time. And from these practices, we've seen these communities benefit from the sale of carbon credits. I think talking of carbon credits, from the community's point of view, it's too far-fetched. I think in terms of selling the ideas to the community, the idea should start from the benefits of them adopting the practices and seeing the benefits from those practices in the short term. For example, we talk of climate-smart agriculture. What's the importance of them adopting climate-smart agriculture? So we are looking at these communities who are vulnerable in terms of food security. They are severely affected by the climate change impacts, and they just don't have the alternative sources of income for them to support their families. So with climate-smart agriculture adopted, we've seen a lot of difference in terms of the yield that farmers produce. The yield give them, obviously, enough food for them to sustain their families, and they also have surplus food for them to sell and earn income that they are able to use to take their families to school. So this, over time, we've seen so many communities coming up and showing the interest and the willingness to implement most of these activities that we are promoting. And over time, we've seen a lot of compliance in terms of adoption of the practices. So now, the question is, how do we sustain these activities by the communities themselves going forward? We've seen a lot of communities earning this income and coming up with diversifying, basically, coming up with different interventions, businesses that they implement within their communities where they are earning income, surplus income that they use to reinvest in their own activities, thereby earning, sequestering more carbon and earning more money again from the sale of the carbon credits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Japhet. Now, while I'm waiting for our colleagues in the IT to get ready the presentation from the next panelists, I would want to give an opportunity to our participants here. You've heard at the continental level what we have put in place. You've heard from the academics. You've heard from the grassroots level. You've heard from our regional economic communities. You've also heard from our civil society. So all of these conversations that we're having and at the different levels within our continent, I want to open the floor if there are any questions you would want to direct to these panelists. If I can see by show of hands. Okay, I see one, the lady at the back, two, and gentleman here, three. Go ahead, number one.
Thanks.
Please, sorry to interrupt you. We'll need your name,
Okay.
your organization, and then you can go ahead with your question.
Thanks. I'm Tabi Joda. I'm an expert in agroforestry, land and food system value chains. I lead 1 Billion Trees for Africa initiative. Very quickly, I just wanted to make some observations and praise African Union for that land governance framework. I wish to raise a few points and also address a couple of concerns from the interventions from my friends from the academia and those from the different research. So first, the framework was a little, will need out just in form of recommendation. Please need to identify stakeholders in a very critical way, because some of the stakeholders that I see highlighted actually has a limitation to some. In Africa, by history and anthropology, farmers, you can't talk about farmers and herders without talking about hunters and local artisans, fishermen, and local service providers. It is very important. These definitions must critically appear in our literature, because by nature, we are huge hunters and gatherers and fishers and herders and farmers. Then I want to also bring to your attention this whole idea of the nomenclature of, we call them small scale farmers. This is not an African terminology. It does not exist in any language in Africa. We only have farmers, whether small or big, yes. Okay, that is two. The third one is, I want to also call upon us to be able to look around how to really address our science and research in a way that it is Africa-centric, like my brother talked about, community-centered approach or community-centered research. Most of the research that we are using is imported research that is so much absent or that has very little consideration of the indigenous aspects of African knowledge and science. So it needs to come strongly on this debate and also in the policy document, so well so that
in there, but some of our own citizens that have not been part of this broader conversation. So if I could start, and then Prof, you can also come in with your perspectives. Jafet Sulu, let me start with you. 2 minutes. Prof, you want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, 2 minutes.
Okay. With regards to what the first commentator said, there's what we now call co-knowledge production or co-production of knowledge. You cannot assume you at the top there, you know it all. You still have to go down and work closely with the people and take their views and add to yours and come up with something that is workable for all of you. And that is what communities are doing now with climate resilience, innovations. That's why we have local adaptation and so on. So they are doing that, and we have evidence all over the globe that it is important to work with local people to get the best result if you want. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just mention, I think that was very great. And yeah, we are moving from just Eurocentric, research to bringing it back here to Afrocentric understanding of our issues. And I thank Tabi for what he's bringing on board, that we concentrate also on understanding our indigenous, mechanisms, solutions to our problems. My sister is talking about also the challenges on mobility, migration because of insecurity, and as a result becoming displaced. I'll not say that refugees in their own countries, but they get displaced. And the question of marginalization now, was talking to one of my professors about this aspect of vulnerability to climate change of some of the countries in Africa, and I was very happy to hear her say that the whole of Africa is vulnerable, not even as a small group of people who we can consider as vulnerable. It's like all of us in this region are vulnerable to the challenges of climate change. Because we heavily rely on agriculture, we heavily rely on natural resources, and these are the things that are heavily affected by climate change effects. When we're talking about mobility, and especially in the context of the mobile communities in the arid areas, the pastoralists, when it is dry, they move from one place to another. Again, they move because of insecurity. That means the governments have several things to do. Allow me to mention this, Janet. Number one, towards responsiveness on the issues of climate change and drought, we need to start looking at coming back to policies that encourage rangeland extensification in our regions, especially for pastoral arid communities. I mean, communities who live in the arid areas. And secondly, from what even my sister is saying, the government should also encourage what we are calling facilitating mobility, whether internal or cross-border. We have come up with policies after the colonization which close us within our borders. Climate change is not a respecter of international borders. And so when there is drought in this one country or one region, the people should have a way of moving to another region and access resources. When they are accessing those resources, then they are able to come back. And so facilitating orderly mobility is a responsibility of the government, is a responsibility of the state. And that's what we are encouraging. Through IGAD, for instance, we have come up with a protocol we call the Protocol on Transhumance, which encourages and supports orderly mobility of pastoralists from one country to another and coming back safely so that they are able to access equal rights with the citizens of those countries. If we are talking about a free movement regime to all citizens, why marginalize some of these mobile communities? That's where we are heading to. And lastly, the aspect of adaptation, because the question of adaptation has been discussed a long time, and we are stuck with the whole adaptation mechanisms which lock us actually into a way that we become obsolete in terms of discussing adaptation. We should now start looking at promoting adaptive capacities and giving what we are calling optionalities to these communities. When there is drought, when there is another event, insecurity, what are the options we can provide for them? That's the responsibility of the government, to show optionalities so that there are several options to take into consideration when you are hit by effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Japhet. Udas?
Thank you, Dr. Janet. I think the aspect of inclusion is very crucial. Actually, the best way to exclude people is to say that you are all the same. And I've seen some countries when they want to exclude indigenous people, they say we are all indigenous. So I think the point of ensuring that everyone is on board, especially when it comes to, for example, frameworks that are addressing issues like land governance and climate change, ensuring that tools that are available to implement those frameworks are considering different aspects. Our brother has given examples of rural women who are doing what they do best, and that they need to be considered when you develop tools. Are those tools really considering people who have not gone to school? How are they included? How are they included when tools are developed to address climate change? So the issue of inclusion is very crucial if we are to succeed this struggle. And one probably approach that we promote at ILC is to work through what we call multi-stakeholder platforms. I think if you could promote this approach even at community level, where everyone is brought on board when there are consultations, and that we ensure that everyone is on board and not assuming that we are all there, but we ensure that everyone is on board. So inclusion is very key. Maybe be a very quick comment on the question that my brother Sarah asked about the process of developing this land governance strategy. We've been with the African Union in this process, and we are also working with several civil society organizations collecting inputs. Probably some have not been reached, but the efforts to include civil society organization was really made, and ILC, at least ILC members were fully involved, and we've been involved in collecting those inputs. And I think that was also an effort towards really having an inclusive land governance strategy that will guide, I think, land processes moving forward.
Thank you very much, Japhet. And maybe just an addition, I think the gentleman was also asking whether or not any of the African Union member states has already taken it on to domesticate the strategy. So the strategy has been adopted by our ministers, and we're expecting to have it launched during the conference on land policy in Africa. We're still going to present it again, and so we will still have the opportunity. And like Japhet Odas had said, we had made the process as inclusive as possible. There were lots of consultations that we had with all the various stakeholders at various levels for us to be able to come up with that particular strategy. I want to take one more hand. Yes, the gentleman at the back with the yellow, with the yellow badge has been very insistent. And after he gives his question very briefly, I will request now that our IT can present the presentation of the sixth or the fifth panelist. Go ahead, sir. Do we have another mic? Okay, if it's... Do we have another mic? Okay, so while we're waiting for the mic, I'll give you the floor, sir. Can we have the presentation of the fifth panelist, please? We can't hear the audio.
being overlooked when we speak about climate change, gender. My presentation will be in two parts. The first one is showing how the bank ensures that the needs of women, youth, and small-scale farmers are taken into consideration. The second part will be on aspects which are still being overlooked when we speak about climate change, gender, and land rights. The bank's work on land is within the context of land rights as human rights, sustainable development goals, the African Declaration on Land Issues and Challenges, and the bank supports the implementation of the AU Declaration through African Land Policy Center, which is a tripartite formed by Economic Commission for Africa, African Union, as well as the African Development Bank. How does the bank support land rights in Africa? The African Development Bank has approached land governance issues in various ways, taking into account its vision and sector policies, as well as concerns of our regional member countries. Over the last 30 years, the bank has approved over 2,530 loans and grants to its regional member countries, of which a high proportion have been in the agriculture and rural sector, transport, water, and industry and mining. As you all know that the bank invests on land which is secured, so all of these investment programs and projects are being undertaken and taken into considerations issues which are related to land. Our work has been focusing on four main areas: knowledge management, lending and operational projects, technical assistance, and policy dialogue and advocacy. We have been working with regional member countries on land reforms. We are also looking at land rights, land restoration, and on the policy and dialogue and advocacy, we are having a flagship which we are co-organizing with African Union and Economic Commission for Africa, which is the African Land Policy Conference, which for this year will be held in November. The bank's strategy towards realizing improved delivery of the bank's investment through integration of land governance is driven by a set of guidelines which were developed in 2021. The guidelines development undertook a consultative and participatory process, which includes stakeholders who are the beneficiaries of our grants and loans. We involve these particular stakeholders in making sure that their concerns and concerns of communities on the ground are taken into consideration when designing the bank's programs and projects. So we took the whole project cycle, taking through task managers, through a training, as well as country economists who are involved in the development of country programs. The development of the guidelines for mainstreaming land governance in our programs and projects are based on the studies we did in 8 regional member countries, and also a review which was done in 2019 on our 10 years implementations. There were emerging issues which were identified. Some of them are highlighted here. One of them is that sustainable land management practice adoption has been very limited in some of the countries, and also land rights influence the adoption of sustainable land management practices as well as climate smart agricultural practices. And also where there is no or there is limited incentives in terms of land rights, the investment on land management by small scale holders or youth or women was also very much limited. We also found out that while norms inhibit women's access to land, rainfall is a big determinant in women's activities. Women recover from post-disaster shock slower than men. And women are the majority who don't have documentation when it comes to land. So in case of migration, it's very difficult for women to return on the land they use. The youth depend on how much power and control both men and women have over the piece of land. And also when women are given land rights, efforts to tackle effects of climate change are more successful. With the findings, we continue our work with the regional member countries in creating enabling environment, in promoting land rights intervention, also in trying to clarify that intersection between climate change, gender, and land rights. We do this through policy dialogues and through mainstreaming these particular elements in our programs and projects. And we are hoping that the interventions we are undertaking on the ground will be upscaled in order to create that awareness as well as impact on the ground with our programs, through our programs and projects.
The audio seems to have gone. Yes. Anyway, our colleague was concluding. This is Maria Saguti. She's the Chief Lands Officer in the African Development Bank. So she sent us a recorded presentation. Now I've been required to round up this session, but I had promised the gentleman at the back there with the yellow badge. Very quickly, maybe in 30 seconds, if you could give us your question, yeah. And I could request the relevant panelists you're directing it at to respond, and then the director will give us the concluding remarks. Go ahead,
Okay,
sir.
thank you, Madam. My name is Johnson Kemp. I work with UNDP in South Sudan as Senior Climate and Security Advisor. It's really important to learn that we are discussing land governance because there are critical elements linked to this. Land is heritage, land is wealth, and land is identity, which are major sources of conflict. Even though we are looking at mobility as a major way of addressing climate change, especially in nomadic systems, we should recognize that there is a big issue in terms of there are two conflicting areas of land governance, and that is access and ownership, as we heard from that madam before. So my first question is, how do we frame land governance to satisfy the needs for mobility in terms of access and ownership in terms of those who own the land, whether it's cultural heritage or otherwise? Secondly, how do the AU system balance traditional system of land governance? Because in most pastoral systems, one of the things that is helping to moderate seasonal migration is through traditional land governance system. Because one of the things we're observing in South Sudan, where I am, is that it's no more seasonal migration, but protracted displacement due to flood of pastoralists who go to a place they don't know when they will return. So it changes this whole dynamic of what you said before, the IGAD protocol. We've tried to domesticate it, but it's quite out of continuum in that kind of new sudden onset event like flood, where people flee because of the disaster that is coming on. Thank you very much.
Japheth, can I give you 30 seconds for that?
Thank you. And I think it's good to also, as we discuss this, I appreciate what he said. It's not just about mobility, but promoting land ownership and the land rights for these communities. That's very key. We continue to emphasize that even as we promote the protocol. It's also good to understand what the protocol talks about and what it carries, the spirit behind it and the letter. It's not just about mobility, but about promoting the rights and accessibility of all the needs, basic needs, and the rights of these communities. So it goes beyond mobility. It comes to also harmonization of policies, including land policies in the different countries and in different regions, touching on the mobile populations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me give the director the floor for his concluding remarks. Dr. Godfrey.
Thank you, Janet. Very quickly, because we have run out of time, let me start by thanking all of you, and particularly the panelists that have joined us this afternoon. A big hand for them. And you, the participants, for making this an exciting side event. So maybe 5 quick points I picked from both the panelists and from the audience. The need to broaden stakeholder definitions. I think that was quite loud. Second is the need for security of tenure on land, particularly for women, and more specifically those in transhumance communities. Third is improving the quality of implementation of continental strategies at country level, that we do have a lot of these strategies, but implementation remains a challenge. Number 4, and it's an interesting idea of this cross-country seasonal migration of nomad communities across our boundaries. It is something that we would want to see how, if it's working, where it is working, and under what circumstances cross-border movements are allowed. The final one, and it's a little bit controversial, but let me end with it. So I'm struggling with understanding this concept of indigenous Africans. Are there Africans that came from outside Africa? You had yesterday President Ruto say, according to the findings from, we all started from here. So is there somebody who did not start from here? I said it would be controversial, and I meant it. So we can continue this conversation outside the hall. I'm struggling with understanding who are these Africans that are not indigenous to Africa. So with that, thank you very much.
So thank you very much, participants. You have been very engaging, very interactive. We'll be available to take on any more comments. We will be happy to share our details with you going forward. And a big thank you and a round of applause for my panelists as well. Thank you very much. So let's be up here. We can take a group photo, just 1 minute for a group photo, and then we will leave the stage for the next session.